World War I ended in 1918, but not the anger and animosity it brought. And by 1939, a new generation is going to embark on a new war. World War I was supposed to have been the war to end all wars, but within a generation, there's another world war. How did this affect British Columbia?
Well, in a lot of ways, World War II had an even greater impact on British Columbia than World War I did. Part of the reason for that was that in 1941, Japan entered the war. All of a sudden, there was a Pacific front in addition to the European front. So the World War came a lot closer to home than it did previously. In the years after 1941-42, there was a real concern about Japanese attack. The fortifications of the province were increased dramatically. Everybody was put on a war footing. Everyone was expected to contribute in some way to the war effort. There was the Japanese internment. There was the construction of army camps around the province. There was the whole air raid protocol that was developed, and there was a real concern about attack. What's interesting locally is that the Alberni Valley sort of presents a microcosm of those things occurring, not least of which the Japanese internment, which took a lot of workers and a lot of families away from the region. They had to find new people to work in the fishing industries. They had to find new ways to produce food products in the Alberni Valley. A lot of the local farms that produce vegetables and so forth had been run by Japanese. At McLean Mill, there was a large Japanese crew working. All of a sudden, those guys were all out of there, as well as at the Somas Mill, at the same time that there was a massive demand for lumber in support of the war effort. So yeah, moving the Japanese out did have a big impact.
Hello, Gerald. Come on in.
Thanks.
How are you today?
I'm doing great.
I'd like to show you some stuff here, Gerald.
Okay.
This is a picture of my grandfather after he got out of the service.
Ryan Watson is a grandson of well-known Port Alberni entrepreneur George Watson of Watson's Paint. Like many young men of his time, he signed up to serve in World War II.
He enlisted when he was 22 in 1941. He went off to Manitoba where he completed his training, and then he went to Prince Edward Island where he became an instructor, and he instructed for gunnery and bombing. He served in various posts throughout England, as an instructor, as a sergeant. I know he had something to do with what they call the Goodyear Army.
The Goodyear Army, officially Operation Fortitude. What it was an elaborate plan by the Allies to help confuse the Germans. Tanks, landing craft, and various other assorted vehicles made out of lumber, canvas, and rubber, so that they'd actually look like real vehicles and that the Germans would think we had far more tanks, vehicles, landing craft, etc. than what we really had. Also, the second part of the plan was to make sure that the Germans thought we were going to land at the Pas de Calais, not Normandy, so that hopefully Normandy would not be armed and waiting. But George wanted to do more than just train young men. He wanted to serve himself.
He had trained enough people at one point, he had said to me, that he then wanted, as they started to bomb Germany, he wanted to be in a more active role. He had felt that he had seen enough of these young men go.
Like many returning veterans, George put the war behind him.
When the war was over, it was done. He put it aside, and he then went to serve the community. He was a Mason for some 46, 47 years, working his way up in that social community. He at one time had been a Grand Master. He was involved in the Rotary, which he had been a president of. the golf course, which again he had been president of a couple of times. He was involved in the Beaufort School, which was he helped fund and start that, which was a pre-start to the Mental Health and Addictions Agency today, which he was the first president of.
And many men came home with what we now know as PTSD.
I would have to say I'm sure it did. I'm sure he watched a lot of men suffer from that. A lot of men suffer from not knowing how to deal with it. So maybe he felt that's how he could help with it. By seeing people suffer, maybe he felt that there was more to it. Not knowing necessarily what their pain was, but knowing that everybody has their own.
But whatever pain George had from the war, he kept to himself.
He talked very, very little about it to really, he didn't talk about it to anybody. There was little bits and pieces I would find throughout his house, covered in decades of dust, that I would bring out to him. And Grandpa, what's this? And Grandpa, what's this? And oh, those are from the war. And as a persistent little kid, I would keep bringing them out and keep bringing them out. And eventually, with my persistence, it drew him out to tell me little bits more and a little bit more. And even though he didn't tell me a lot, the family was very surprised at how much he still had told me.
And why did these young men go?
That's what you did in that time. When the country said that you went, you went.
George Watson was a true everyday hero. He went to war and served his country when needed, and when he came back, he was here to serve his community. But Ryan's true hero is the George Watson that started Watson's Paint, a community business that endured for almost 5 decades.
My idea of my grandfather as a hero was the man who I went to see in the paint store. He was the man who fed me sugar cubes for dusting paint cans. It wasn't until I got much older in life that I realized that that was a part of him being a hero too. The quietness. He never looked for attention for what he did. He never looked for thanks. He just did what he felt was his duty. And again, when he came home, again did what he felt was his duty. He served in both perspectives, and he did what he thought was his job.
There was a real sense of duty initially when the war started, although it was moderated because of the Depression, because of conditions locally. In 1939, industrial production in BC was down about 20% from what it had been in 1929 because of the Depression. People were not in that positive a state of mind. The war sort of gave a burst of excitement to people in a lot of ways. Negative excitement, but excitement nonetheless. What's interesting is that Canada didn't jump into the war right away like they did in World War I. They waited about 10 days. September 10th is when war was actually declared by Parliament. And the reason for that was that there was a fair bit of resistance in some parts of the country, like in Quebec, to getting involved in another European war. They didn't really believe in that kind of adventurism. Also, the country was in bad financial shape, so they didn't want to get involved. In BC, it was sort of a positive thing economically when war broke out. All of a sudden, there was a focus on shipbuilding in particular. Aircraft construction started picking up again. The forest industry was really prospering because of the demand from Europe, as European sources of lumber had all been cut back. So things were pretty good economically. Fairly shortly after the war started, into early 1940, there was basically full employment in BC. This was a combination of younger men signing up in huge numbers. There was, again, this really strong support from BC for the war effort. And the stats are interesting. There were about 181,000 young men between 18 and 45 in the province at the time. 91,000 of them enlisted, over 50%. And that was by far the highest proportion anywhere in the country. This took a lot of men out of the workforce. There wasn't the direct threat of attack. The war was in Europe, the war was on the Atlantic. So the East Coast was affected, the East Coast of Canada, but not so much BC. This high rate of contribution to the war effort, but no real direct impacts in those first years. Now, that all changed dramatically with the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. The first thing that happened the next day is that they seized all the Japanese fishing vessels on the coast. And the Japanese owned about 20–30% of the fishing fleet at that time. These were seen as being a strategic threat, so they just rounded them all up. They sent out the military and the police to do that. In the successive months, the Japanese successfully took Singapore, successfully took Hong Kong, and then took the American Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska. This is all by the spring of 1942. Massive fear as a result. All of a sudden, everybody in BC is thinking, well, gee, we could really be attacked too. There could really be an air attack. There could really be a Japanese invasion. And the sense of threat goes up exponentially, and everybody is really worried into 1942.
Did you know part of Port Alberni's wartime heritage was not here on the Pacific, but on the Atlantic? HMCS Alberni is a small Flower-class corvette. Originally laid in 1940, it was commissioned in 1941. Even though these corvettes are Flower class, in Canada they're named after the various communities, because in Canada we believe the communities will support ships, not flowers. After being commissioned, HMCS Alberni sails to Halifax and arrives there April 13th. Between May and November of that year, she makes 4 runs from St. John's, Newfoundland to Reykjavik, Iceland, escorting convoys. HMCS Alberni was involved in a number of sea battles. One of them in September lasted 3 days. While escorting convoy SC-42, they had lost 15 merchant ships. HMCS Alberni was involved with hunting U-boats and picking up survivors of this convoy. This is a very dangerous assignment, as picking up survivors, your ship has to slow down or stop, and a stopped ship is an easy target. Again, in another sea battle, HMCS Alberni is escorting another convoy, HX-212. In this battle, they have lost 6 ships, and HMCS Alberni has picked up 91 survivors. This is a convoy that is taking HMCS Alberni to a new destination. It's going to be Operation Torch, which is the invasion of North Africa. And HMCS Alberni escorted many convoys, places like Gibraltar, Algiers, Oran, many other ports. After many other voyages, HMCS Alberni is sent home for refit. After refit, she does a brief time in Bermuda for trials, and then it's off to England. In preparation for the Normandy landings, HMCS Alberni becomes part of Operation Neptune. This entails clearing the English Channel of any enemy submarines or warships, aircraft. They're part of the protection of the troops and supplies heading into Europe. It's August 21st, 1944, and HMCS Alberni is traveling on a southerly course at 14 knots. She's about 2/3 of the way to her patrol area when all of a sudden she's hit by a massive explosion. She's been torpedoed by U-480. The worst of it is, most of the crew are below in the mess decks, and Alberni is sinking fast. Within 20 seconds her decks are awash, and in less than a minute she's sunk below the waves with 59 of her crew. Only 31 members survive. The community of Port Alberni helped HMCS Alberni immensely. They had sent many comforts such as wool socks, an industrial potato peeler, and even a washing machine to help the crew. This is one time when the community stood behind their ship and the people who had gone out to defend them. Everybody thinks of the home front as something to do in England. The old fellows with the rifles ready to stand guard. But we had a home front here also.
There were old guys and rifles, that was part of it. But there were a lot of different aspects of it, absolutely. So, first of all, one of the things that you mentioned earlier was the Japanese internment. And that was a very serious thing. In BC, there were about 23,000 Japanese and Japanese-Canadian inhabitants when Pearl Harbor hit. About 21,000 of those people were interned. What that meant is that they had to be moved more than 100 miles away from the coast, and the more of a threat they were seen to be, the further away they were moved. This is when they set up internment camps or took over old mining villages as camps. What it meant for BC was, first of all, it spooled up that whole anti-Japanese sentiment, treated as enemies. The Japanese had their property seized. I mentioned the fishing boats earlier. They also had their farms and their houses and their businesses seized, often sold at fire sale prices after that. So there was a property issue, a sort of jealousy of the Japanese owning property that didn't actually exist in the States in the same sort of way during World War II. They did intern the Japanese, but didn't do that whole thing. Because the Japanese were moved out of the fishing industry, moved out of the canneries, moved out of the sawmills, such as McLean Mill, it meant that they had to find new workers to fill these jobs. And this is where you start to move women into industry. It's where you start to move people from other regions into industry. In the case of Alberni, one of the dramatic examples of that was the plywood mill that was built in 1942, just concurrent with all this happening. It was put in by H.R. McMillan, later of McMillan Blodell. He was also in charge of procurement of wood resources and timber resources during World War II for the war effort. And he knew that plywood was in high demand. Plywood was the new miracle product. It could be used to build boxes for shipping ammunition. It could be used to build army camps and military installations very quickly. This was a big success. It really produced heavily. The interesting part is about 80% of the people working in it were women. They put out a call to recruit workers to Vancouver Island, to the prairies, even down into the States, and it was answered by young women who came in. They became the plywood girls, and a lot of them continued to work after the war in this industry. The war effort took two sort of parts. There was the military part of it. So home defense is what they always referred to it as. And again, with Pearl Harbor and with the fear of attack, this really spooled up. One of the things that made it take off on Vancouver Island was the shelling of the lighthouse at Estevan Point in June of 1942. This is just after the Japanese had invaded the Aleutians and so forth. So everybody's really panicky. Well, they're coming right off our coast and they're shelling our buildings. What will we do? What will we do? The military, and this is all three branches, the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force, all increased their capacity on the coast in a big way. Mostly the Air Force was looking for submarines. Submarine hunting was what they did, with various bomber squadrons and fighter squadrons up and down the coast, including out at Ucluelet and Tofino. There was a group in the Navy called the Fishermen's Reserve, being started before the war to monitor the Japanese action on the coast. When Pearl Harbor happened in early 1942, all of a sudden they were given a whole fleet of 100 landing craft. These are like the ones you see on the beaches in Europe and that. There was a group of them set up at Alberni, as well as Comox, as well as at Ucluelet and so forth. The idea was if there was a Japanese attack, this sort of naval militia group could respond quickly. Another really interesting group locally was the Pacific Coast Militia Rangers. And these again were established in April, just after the Pearl Harbor thing, April of 1942. The militia rangers were local guys who, for one reason or another, couldn't enlist in the regular forces. They were often loggers or miners, fishermen, people that were active on the coast already. Fair number of First Nations people participated, and they signed up, about 200 of them locally, to sort of keep an eye open, to surveil and reconnoiter for any kind of Japanese activity, anything that might happen. They were active right through the war after that point. One of the things that people remember about the Albernis during the war was the army camp. About 1,500 men put in. Now, the whole population of the Alberni Valley at the time was about 7,000 people. All of a sudden, you've got 1,500 people plopped in. First to construct it, and then to reside in the army camp. Theoretically, they were defending the community. In fact, there was a fair bit of tension because of what I mentioned earlier. They were conscripts. 2/3 of the 35,000 men involved in home defense were conscripts, zombies. The local guys that all signed up in the military, local people didn't really like these folks being around. A lot of them were Quebecois. These were also seen as kind of outsiders, people that didn't want to support the war effort. So it created some interesting tensions with the local population.
Good morning, Kirsten. I see you have a few interesting items from the Second World War.
They are. These are some interesting things from the public that when we put a call out asking for people's memories of the Homefront, these are some of the things that they brought in. These here are ration tokens that are for meat, and then these are other ration books, all with little stamps inside. They've been used for various people. And up here, there's a little something to go with it. Many of the different companies, this one's from Robin Hood, would put out ration cookbooks, so how to deal with the new rations, and so various little cookbook tricks to use that.
I remember my grandmother used to tell me how she'd save certain ration tokens because they never used them in their family and trade them for others that they did need.
Okay.
I'm sure there was a lot of that going on.
Yeah, I'm sure there is, because everyone had their little
yes.
ration books set out.
Yeah. Yes, and I see ARP.
ARP, the Air Raid Patrol, yeah. So these are little books about the Air Raid Patrol. This one is how to prepare your home for blackout. So it's a whole little book, and it has a little series of pictures of how you would black out the windows or other portions of your house to deal with. So, yeah, didn't want any lights on.
Okay, yeah, so the enemy wouldn't see you if they were coming over for bombing. And of course, if something did happen, I guess there must have been first aid needed, and they wanted everybody to learn a bit of first aid.
First, these pieces and the air down here are both from Vivian Thompson. So she did some training and some first aid, but she also did training here in the air spotting the planes in the air. So this is a lovely little set she's brought. This is her in her little uniform. She's just a small person in a uniform. And then this is her certificate for being in the Ground Observer Corps. So it's part of the RCAF, and she became part of the Ground Observer Corps. That's her special pin, says Ground Observer Corps. And this is her spotter. So it came in this little package. And this is what she'd use. It's a clear with spots, so you can hold it up to the sky, and depending which circle is in, you can see which plane is in there.
And of course, if the plane fills the bigger circle, it's closer. That's quite interesting.
Yes, I mean, there's a number of things around that people have in their home, but these are just, some that people brought in to share with us.
You know, my grandmother used to tell me how she would knit for the soldiers, and I believe a couple of her daughters also did a bit of that and sent things over to Europe.
Absolutely. The war effort involved everybody, and civil society had to contribute. There was sort of this constant promotion of how everybody had to contribute to the war effort. So women did things like that. They knitted. There were specific patterns for everything from socks to helmet covers to scarves to mitts that would be done for the soldiers. You also found women sewing bandages and blankets and so forth for the Red Cross to ship overseas. Anything that did support the war effort. They would put together care packages of jams and jellies and cooking and so forth, send that off. Very, very common practice during this period. There was also a big effort to raise money for the war effort. This is when victory bonds were promoted and sold. They would often bring in celebrities or aircraft from Britain or war heroes to sell more and more victory bonds. This would raise money for the federal government to pay for the war effort. Kids would collect scrap. Kids would collect the wrappers from their gum and so forth. And this would also be used to support the war effort. So everybody got involved. On a local level, you had air raid patrols. These would be volunteers. These would be the old guys with rifles you were talking about before. They would keep an eye open that nobody would have lights on after dark, that there would be blackout conditions, that everybody would be on guard in case there was some kind of air attack occurring. You also had women, mostly women, being trained as aircraft detection corps. These would be people who were given little guide books or cards to recognize Japanese aircraft, and they would be sent out to keep an eye on the skies all the time to say if any enemy aircraft were approaching the area. So again, everybody from children to women to old fellows would all be expected to play their part in case of an attack and to be sure that everybody was kept safe.
By the end of 1945, the Second World War had ended. It had brought out the best and worst in people. The best were the quiet heroes, those young men and women who had signed up because they knew what had to be done, not because it was going to gain them anything. They just knew what we had to do. If any of your family members have been part of this war and you'd like to know more, feel free to drop by our local museum. They have plenty of information, and the staff is always willing to help. This is Gerald Watson, your friendly neighborhood time traveler, and I'll see you next time, whenever in time that may be.